Hey everybody, welcome to McNulty's Book Corral. I'm your host, Thomas McNulty, and today we're going to be talking about Rod Serling. Now, Rod Serling, of course, is best known as the creator and host for the Twilight Zone television series. So we're going to begin with that because we're going to get to the books in a minute. We have some books to look at, but I want to talk about the television show. Rod Serling was a writer. He wrote for television. He did some film work as well. But the Twilight Zone stands as an example of one of the most brilliant creative efforts, I think, in history, especially television history. So most of you are familiar with the Twilight Zone. This is a complete DVD set of the Twilight Zone. And I want to mention a couple of specific episodes that resonate with me, that I think represent Rod Serling's fantastic talent. My favorite episode, and the episode that I think everybody should watch, aired in November of 1961, and that's Death's Head Revisited, which tackled the idea of a Nazi, and it involves a concentration camp, the Dachau concentration camp. It's a haunting episode. It's a hard episode to watch. It's moving. It's brutal, but it's the most important television episode that I think ever aired in my lifetime. And the fact that it was aired by itself is an amazing thing, and I think it's a testament to the television station and to Rod Serling to get that done. Rod Serling wrote the teleplay for this episode during the Adolf Eichmann trial, and Eichmann was a Nazi they had captured, and when he stood trial, he refused to take responsibility for his actions in the Holocaust, which was something that was quite upsetting to, I think, Rod Serling and everyone else. And so the episode Death's Head Revisited was a response to that, a fictional response to that. And as most of you know, Rod Serling wrote the most of the opening and closing narrations. Not all of them. He didn't write every episode. Richard Matheson and many others wrote episodes. I'm talking about Rod Serling today. Now, Death's Head Revisited, he did write the opening and closing narration. I'm going to read to you the closing narration because I think it resonates today. In a world filled with hatred today, it's good to come back and look at this material and to remind ourselves on certain things that we need to be aware of. And Rod Serling resonates with me, unlike most. And I'm a huge fan. I consider him one of the most important creative forces during my lifetime. So he wrote at the end of the episode, all the Dachaus must remain standing. The Dachaus, the Belsens, the Buchenwalds, the Auschwitzes, all of them. They must remain standing because they are a monument to a moment in time when some men decided to turn the earth into a graveyard. Into it, they shoveled all of their reason, their logic, their knowledge, but worst of all, their conscience. And the moment we forget this, the moment we cease to be haunted by its remembrance, then we become the gravediggers, something to dwell on and to remember, not only in the Twilight Zone, but wherever men walk God's earth. Rod Serling remains one of the most relevant creators in the television industry. There's nothing out there compared to him today. They have tried to reboot the series multiple times, but the original is what it is. Now, I want to mention that because Rod Serling, remains one of the most important influences in my life. My favorite episode is Walking Distance, October 1959, starring Gig Young. That's an episode I think that resonates with many, many people besides myself. I've talked to a lot of Twilight Zone fans, and we all pretty much agree. That's a softer episode, but it has such relevance to us. Nostalgia plays a role in everything, and we can't deny that. And Walking Distance is about a man that goes back to his past to address some issues and things that were relevant to him in his life. He's trying to escape from the stressful business world that he is currently involved in, and he goes back. It's Walking Distance. The past is but walking distance. It's a great episode. I think it's probably another one of the finest episodes of The Twilight Zone. My other one is Time Enough at Last, starring Burgess Meredith, which is about a reader. And I think most of you bookhounds out there are familiar with Time Enough at Last, which talks about a post-apocalyptic world. The Twilight Zone it's incomparable. There's again nothing out there like it. Every episode is a delight to watch. All of these decades later. So I just wanted to start out this discussion today before we talk about the books with a little bit of my feelings about the show because I might do this again. I might talk about some relevant television shows that have a connection. Rod Serling was a brilliant writer. His work is superb in every way. So we'll talk about the books a little bit. There are some good books to read in print. Rod Serling is still in print, and he published far more than people realize. So if you get a chance, do that. Now here is, to capitalize upon the success of the show, Rod Serling wrote the prose versions of some of the episodes, and this is the hardcover first edition. And there he is, the great Rod Serling. Boy, do we wish he was around today. Now, you'll note the title of this hardcover is From the Twilight Zone. From the Twilight Zone is the title. The book published The Mighty Casey, Escape Clause, Where Is Everybody? The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, Walking Distance, The Whole Truth, A Lonely Dust, The Midnight Sun, Mr. Dingle the Strong, The Odyssey of Flight 33, The Big Tall Wish, Rip Van Winkle Caper, and The Shelter. These were prose versions that Rod Serling wrote, prose versions of the television episode. Now, this edition is notable for several reasons. First, the title is From the Twilight Zone, which would be changed in later editions to Stories from the Twilight Zone, which is this paperback edition. The paperback version of this book is probably what most of you are familiar with, Stories from the Twilight Zone. Now, the differences are kind of profound, too, because the hardcover does not reproduce the opening or closing narrations as the paperback does. The paperback actually reproduces the closing narrations for the first time at the end of the prose. They did it here, and you can actually see it down here. So getting the closing narration that Rod Serling wrote, and then of course they didn't reproduce the opening narration, but just the closing narrations, and that is not available in the hardcover first edition. So there's a distinction to be made here. So you hardcover first edition collectors, I think you're probably familiar with that, but some of the fans may not know that. I believe now all of the editions on the market of this and the other Twilight Zone stories feature the closing narration. I don't have the collected edition of these. So this is probably one of the more important vintage paperbacks from the 1960s. This would be the hardcover collection, and then the paperback. This one here is really the one that most people seek. I think it's available. It's on eBay. I don't think it's hard to find in really good shape either. It's a great book, and this is the preeminent one. And Serling followed that with more stories from the Twilight Zone, new stories from the Twilight Zone. These are all, again, prose versions of Twilight Zone stories that most of you book collectors are familiar with. And then something really fascinating to me was later on he had Walter B. Gibson, who was the primary writer on the Shadow pulps from the 1930s and 40s. Walter B. Gibson, the great Walter B. Gibson, wrote prose versions of stories that never aired. These were, from what I understand, and if I'm wrong, let me know, these were outlines from Serling, ideas that Serling had, ideas that Gibson had to put out some paperbacks to exploit the idea of the Twilight Zone. By the time these two paperbacks were published, the Twilight Zone was off the air, as far as I know. So these are also highly collectible. I think they're great. It's Walter B. Gibson, for crying out loud. One of the all-time great pulp writers. The stories are haunting. Wonderful material for you vintage book collectors to seek would be those two paperbacks as well. And finally, most of you know that after the Twilight Zone, here is the complete Night Gallery. Rod Serling created the Night Gallery and was the host for this fantastic show as well. Equally as famous as the Twilight Zone, it didn't last as long. And for you vintage book collectors, we have, this was the one that everybody's after. I think the more famous one is they're tearing down Tim Riley's bar, was the episode that most people cite to me as their favorite or one of the better episodes from the Night Gallery. I think there are some others, but fun stuff to get into. If you're a Rod Serling fan, you really need to seek this out. Excuse me. Still in print. Now, when I say still in print, there's a wide variety of Rod Serling material out there. I just want to give you just a little bit of it. The Rod Serling's estate, his wife recently died, by the way, and I'm really sad to hear that. But his daughter is still out there, and she is, I think, handling the estate. These books are on the market that reprint some of his stories and teleplays. And there are other volumes besides what I'm showing you here. This one is particularly fascinating because this reprints one of the all-time great teleplays that Serling wrote, Requiem for a Heavyweight, which was about a boxer. Now, there are 2 filmed versions, I think, widely available, and there may be others, but the one with Jack Palance, and then there's the one with Anthony Quinn. I'm more familiar with the version with Anthony Quinn out there. It's an excellent program to find. I think it's on DVD. But you can find Requiem for a Heavyweight in here, as well as other stories and teleplays that Serling wrote. So these books are out there along with others from the Rod Serling estate. So I want to give a nod to Rod Serling today because his influence is profound. He resonates still and always will. I can't imagine not collecting these books. So if you get a chance, check out Rod Serling for you book collectors out there, or you readers who are unfamiliar with the book versions. If you're familiar with the show, obviously that's great, but try and pick up the book versions. These 2 paperbacks, I think, are the 2 to start with to see what Rod Serling can do. He was also a screenwriter. He was responsible in part for the Planet of the Apes, the famous 1968 film with Charlton Heston. Saddle the Wind, a Western with Robert Taylor, and many other great television shows and stories. So Rod Serling, a tip of the Stetson to you, my friend. Another one of those fantastic writers out there. I never met him. I don't have any signed copies. Darn, it'd be great. But Rod Serling is a force to be reckoned with. So I want to encourage you to seek out not only the DVD sets and watch these shows, discuss these episodes with your family. There's a lot of relevance there, especially in today's world where it's filled with such hatred. Hatred everywhere. And check out Rod Serling's. He was a great writer, actually, really good. I think that if he'd lived longer, he would have gone into writing novels and novellas and done more of that. So there you go. Rod Serling is out there. Remember, thank you for staying in. You can subscribe to this channel, by the way. Please do so. And remember to stay well, stay happy, feed your brain, and somewhere between sunlight and shadow, there's a place for you to read a book in the Twilight Zone. Thank you.